Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander, and welcome to The Great War, where we are still filming in our emergency pandemic lockdown studio here in my living room, with admittedly imperfect sound conditions. Now, by the late spring of 1920, the Treaty of Versailles had come into force, and Germany was still in the grip of political instability and paramilitary violence. The right-wing Kapp Putsch had been put down in mid-March by a general strike, but it had provoked a leftist uprising centered on the western province of Westphalia. And there was tension in the east as well, where in the ethnically mixed region of Upper Silesia and the southern part of East Prussia, there were votes scheduled to determine whether they would join the new Polish Republic or remain with Germany. As if the internal chaos were not enough, Germany was also facing difficult negotiations with the victorious Allies about war reparations, and it all happened 100 years ago. So in this episode, we're going to take a look at the events surrounding the summer of 1920 in the new Weimar Republic. Although the Kapp Putsch had failed in mid-March, the leftist uprising that it had provoked in the Ruhr area of Western Germany carried on. There, different leftist groups like the Independent Social Democrats, the Communists, but also others, created a self-proclaimed Ruhr Red Army, which ended up in combat with local right-wing Freikorps and defeated them in the second half of March. Now, the Ruhr Red Army was left in control of part of what was called the neutral zone. This zone was a 50-kilometer wide strip of land next to the occupied Rhineland, which the Treaty of Versailles forbade German forces from entering. In spite of its success, the uprising was not united, and its more moderate leaders knew that it couldn't last. So they entered into negotiations with the German government, which was dominated by the more moderate majority Social Democrats. Now, this resulted in the Bielefeld Agreement, according to which the Ruhr Red Army would give up its 20,000 rifles, 300 machine guns, and a dozen artillery pieces, in exchange for the government making policy concessions to the workers. The problem was the uprising had no de facto central command and control, and some of its leaders vowed to continue the fight. One of the diehards was Gottfried Caruseit, who has since been alleged to have been working as an agent provocateur on behalf of the German army. So some of the groups refused to disarm. The communist Spartacus newspaper was outraged at first at the negotiations and created its own stab-in-the-back accusation. The Bielefeld delegates, in complete abandonment of their proletarian duty, plunged a dagger into the back of the fighting masses of the proletariat. By the beginning of April, however, both the Communists and the Independent Social Democrats had agreed to lay down their arms, but to continue the revolution by other means, like a general strike. Meanwhile, the German army was pressuring its government to allow it to attack. And on April 1st, the Freikorps EP did launch an attack on the town of Pelkum and killed about 100 people, mostly after they had surrendered. On April 3rd, after having issued and extended an ultimatum, the German government decided that the leftist groups were either not complying with the Bielefeld Agreement or doing so too slowly, and they ordered the army to attack. Now, the planned advance of the German army would be in violation of the Versailles Treaty because it would enter the neutral zone, and so the Germans asked the Allies for permission. Now, the British and Americans did not have a particularly strong interest and were not prepared to make any moves to prevent the German army from entering the neutral zone. But this was not the case for the French and the Belgians. France had suffered extreme economic devastation and human loss during the war, and was now in an uncertain position as it was drifting away from its British allies. The French lobbied the Belgians to join them so they would not seem to be isolated, and the Belgians did, partly in order to protect their own interests in the coming discussions about Luxembourg. The French began to mobilize more troops in case and inform the Germans that if the neutral zone were violated, that they would occupy the city of Frankfurt and several other German towns, with or without the British. The German government and army decided that it was worth the risk, in order to crush what they saw as an armed, organized Bolshevik uprising in the Ruhr region. Some in the army also believed that the French were conspiring with the Ruhr Red Army, but there was no foundation to such conspiracy theories. So the German army advanced, and though there was some scattered fighting, there wasn't much, and they'd secured control of the region south up until the Ruhr River within a week. At this point, the German government ordered their forces to stop at the river. But the general in command, General Oskar von Watter, was not pleased at what he saw as civilian interference in military affairs and wanted to continue the advance. This showed just how difficult it was for some in the German military to accept the new reality of Republican civilian control. Now, the German government held firm against Watter's demands, and he eventually resigned on April 27th. So instead of the army, a paramilitary police force known as the Sicherheitspolizei crossed the river and began to carry out arrests and collect the weapons that were being given up by the insurgents. The Freikorps also crossed the river and busied itself painting swastikas on Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and Jewish headstones. Many of the leftists fled, and between 2,000 and 3,000 ended up in the British occupation zone, but more than 15,000 fled farther into the neutral zone, out of the reach of the German army. Of the several thousand that were arrested, about 1,200 were kept in a former prisoner of war camp left over from the Great War. So the uprising in the Ruhr had been crushed, but it had serious consequences for Germany. About 1,500 German citizens had been killed in the fighting, mostly on the side of the leftists. Politically, the majority Social Democrat Party had once again, as it had in previous crises since the armistice, sided with the army and the Freikorps, and this weakened their appeal to their working class base. In fact, in the election of June 1920, the majority Social Democrats lost 1/3 of their seats and the chancellorship. On the other hand, the more radical independent Social Democrats, and eventually also the Communists, were strengthened. Now, while all this was going on and the German army was crushing the Ruhr Red Army, the French decided to take action because of the violation of the neutral zone by the German forces. On April 6th, French forces under General Jean-Marie de Gautte advanced and occupied Frankfurt and several other nearby cities, against British wishes. French Prime Minister Alexandre Millerand explained France's logic. The French government was forced to act the day it found itself faced with a violation of the treaty that affects all allies, which is particularly sensitive for France because of its geographical situation. France is also faced with the fact that the German government broke its word, which had been personally given during negotiations. The German citizens of these now occupied cities were not particularly pleased at the arrival of French troops, but the French were determined to send a message, as Chief of Staff General Edmond Buat confided to his diary. Everything is going well, at least for a start. I expect the troop trains rolling through the Rhineland will give the Boche the idea that this time we are serious. In Frankfurt, a crowd of German citizens gathered at the arrival of French-Moroccan troops, and the situation soon got out of control. The French troops opened fire and killed 9 Germans and wounded 26 others. The French newspapers blamed the incident on provocations from the German government in Berlin. All of a sudden, once an order arrived from Berlin, a certain excitement took hold of the population. This excitement degenerated into aggression, and our soldiers had to use their weapons in self-defense. For the German government and the German press, this was a massacre of innocents, carried out by an inferior and bloodthirsty race that the French should not have sent to Germany out of principle, an idea that echoed wartime propaganda. Historian Nicolas Beaupré explains the French rationale for sending in the North Africans. For French politicians and the military, the occupation was legitimated by their victory and the peace treaty, so they were free to choose the means to implement it. Sending colonial troops to Germany allowed metropolitan French units to be demobilized more quickly. It was also possible to show the Germans, who had just had their own colonies taken away, that France was not limited to being the neighboring country, and its strength was spread around the world. The incident in Frankfurt gave rise to a German propaganda campaign to vilify French colonial troops, as had already been the case during the war and the occupation of the Rhineland starting in 1919. As of the spring of 1920, the idea of a schwarze Schmach, or black shame, would make headlines across the country and be discussed in Parliament. And in fact, the idea was picked up by the British press in particular, which placed great pressure on France to act. French colonial troops were accused of all manner of violence, crimes, and rape. Now, French army investigations at the time did not substantiate any of these claims, and neither have historians' investigations since then. But at the time, the accusations were widely believed, including by many in the British press and British political circles. This created an international relations scandal for France, and they withdrew the Moroccans after just a few days. But this only added fuel to the fire. Over time, this scandal damaged the French policy in the occupied Rhineland of peaceful penetration, which meant to gain the support of the local population by promoting a positive image of France. On May 17th, French troops withdrew from Frankfurt and the other cities, since the German army had withdrawn from the neutral zone a few days before. The turmoil in Germany and the temporary French occupation of Frankfurt and the other cities increased the tensions between Germany and the Allies regarding the fulfillment of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Both the Kapp Putsch and the Ruhr Uprising had interrupted German production and shipment of coal, which was an important part of the reparations which were to be sent to Belgium and France. The question of financial reparations from Germany to the Allies had also not yet been resolved. And so these questions were discussed at the Spa Conference in July 1920, the first time that the Allies and the Germans had sat at the same negotiating table since before the war. Now, what came out of the conference was the Spa Agreement, which resolved some, but not all, of the open questions surrounding the implementation of the treaty. According to the agreement, the German army's reduction in size and disarmament would be completed by 1921. Coal shipments were detailed and defined and scheduled, which included the interesting side note that the Allies would pay for food for the German workers producing the coal in exchange for being allowed to specify the exact type and quality of the coal that would be sent to Belgium and France. In terms of financial reparations, the proportions were decided. 52% would go to France, 22% would go to Britain, 10% to Italy, and 8% to Belgium. But crucially, there was no agreement yet as to the total amount of these reparations, only to the proportions. To add to the difficulties in Germany, in addition to the Ruhr Uprising, the temporary French occupation, and the difficult Spa Conference, while the conference was still going on, the first of two plebiscites to be held in eastern Germany took place. On July 11th, two regions of the southern part of East Prussia, Allenstein and Marienwerder, voted to determine whether they would remain a part of Germany or join Poland. This was an ethnically mixed region, with about half the population speaking German and half Polish, although the linguistic situation is a little bit muddled by the presence and use of the local Slavic Masurian dialect. Once the plebiscite was held, over 90% of voters chose to remain with Germany, which meant that many Poles voted for the German side. The other region that had scheduled a plebiscite for the near future was the contested region of Upper Silesia, which was claimed entirely by Germany, to which it had belonged until 1918, and partially by Poland. The region's population was about 60% Polish-speaking and about 40% German-speaking, which were mixed throughout the region. But it was all the more important because it contained important mineral deposits and a significant number of mines. Now, the region also had its own particular identity, which was based on Catholicism, difficult relations with Protestant Prussia, and the mixed use by locals of German and Polish. For many Upper Silesians, being an Upper Silesian still meant more to them than being a German or being a Pole, as local author Horst Bielek pointed out in one of his works. It is the tragedy of the Upper Silesian that he is neither a German nor a Pole, but simply an Upper Silesian, and that injustice will be done to him in either case, whether claimed by Germany or by Poland. Gradually, nationalist politics caused an increase in tensions between Germans and Poles. But until 1918, the German cause had the support of the German state. But there were voices on the Polish side as well, like journalist Wojciech Korfanty. The outbreak of war made the situation even worse, as industrial Upper Silesia, like other regions of Germany, was rocked by strikes, and most of the miners in Upper Silesia were Polish. Historian Jochen Böhler describes the process of these increasing tensions. The Great War had turned a huge part of Polish-speaking Upper Silesians from patriots to protesters. Once the armistice was signed and a new Polish Republic was created, this new Polish state could and did lend support to the Polish nationalist movement in Upper Silesia. Now, although both sides framed their claims on the region in nationalist terms, the real prize was old-fashioned territory and resources. The minerals and mines of Upper Silesia were a more important calculation in the claims of both the German and Polish states. Both sides created paramilitary organizations, which were supported by their intelligence services and which engaged in a low-level proxy war. Although officially both governments distanced themselves from the activities of the paramilitaries, they covertly equipped, trained, and encouraged them. The first Upper Silesian Uprising, or Civil War as the Germans call it, began in August 1919. When a German Grenzschutz militia fired on striking Polish workers and killed 10 of them. In the violence that followed, thousands of German troops were brought into the province, and the uprising was crushed within a week. Now, it's important to note that some Polish-speaking units served on the side of the German government, which suggests that even at this stage, there were still some divided loyalties. In February 1920, in preparation for the coming plebiscite, an Allied force of mixed Italian and French troops moved into Upper Silesia under the command of French General Jules Gratier. But even this Allied force, consisting of 5,000 Italian and 15,000 French troops, was unable to stop the cycle of violence. And in particular, during this time, the German paramilitary Sicherheitspolizei did its best to prevent the Poles from organizing themselves politically. Now, the second Upper Silesian Uprising broke out in August 1920, when a French supply train was attempting to cross the region to enter Poland and bring the Poles, whose army was hard-pressed, defending against the Bolsheviks just outside of Warsaw, much-needed ammunition and supplies. A group of Germans began to demonstrate in the hopes of stopping the train from reaching Poland, and then there was a counter-demonstration by local Polish-speaking residents. Things turned violent, and several Poles were killed, which caused the French troops to fire on the Germans and killed several of them. Korfanty called for the dissolution of the German Sicherheitspolizei, and he also called on Polish paramilitaries to rise up, which they did. In the ensuing violence, the Italians tried to stop the killings, but the French were much more ambiguous, which made sense given the French policy of strengthening Poland as much as possible and weakening Germany. Eventually, the Polish paramilitary groups agreed to a ceasefire, but only if they could remain intact. Now, following the second uprising, a locally based, ethnically mixed plebiscite police force was created, but it could not stop the cycle of violence, kidnapping, and murder. The conflict continued into 1921 as a sort of underground war, which German participant Oskar Hauenstein characterized like this. We called this state a war in the dark. In the lead up to the plebiscite, which was eventually held in 1921, both sides used violent tactics in an attempt to influence the outcome of the vote. The Germans even created the Upper Silesian Defense Force, which was directly supported by the German army. Now, when the vote took place, about 60% of voters chose to remain with Germany, even though about 60% of the population was Polish-speaking. So as the summer of 1920 drew to a close, Germany was still in the grip of a crisis. There were ongoing tensions with the Allies over the implementation of the Treaty of Versailles, and internally, the majority Social Democrat Party had been severely weakened by cooperating with the army and Freikorps to crush worker uprisings. On the other hand, the radical leftists were now stronger than ever before, and the Freikorps militia was still a destabilizing force in the country. And in the east, in Upper Silesia, in spite of the vote in March 1921, the situation was far from clear, and the region would soon be rocked by another round of civil war. Thanks again to CuriosityStream for sponsoring this episode. CuriosityStream is a streaming service offering you thousands of high-quality documentaries for just $14.79 a year. When you sign up at curiositystream.com/thegreatwar, you also get Nebula bundled in with your account. On Nebula, you can watch a whole variety of creators like us ad-free and support us at the same time. There is original content on Nebula as well, which you won't see here on YouTube. For example, we're releasing our documentary series 16 Days in Berlin on Nebula, the most detailed documentary about the Battle of Berlin, one of the last big battles of World War II. And for several reasons that we won't go into at the moment, we won't be able to upload it here on YouTube due to YouTube's content restrictions. So go to curiositystream.com/thegreatwar and sign up for just $14.79 for an entire year. Now, we'd like to thank Camille Arlé-Vargas for her help in preparing this episode. And if you want to see the sources we used for this episode, you can check them out in the video description below. And in that video description, you'll also find a link to our Great War audio podcast, where you can learn all sorts of additional information about the topic that we covered today and all sorts of other topics related to the Great War and the conflicts that followed it. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1920, a production of Real-Time History and the only YouTube history channel whose pandemic lockdown studio will echo throughout history.